Do you remember, in 2017, What the Waters Left Behind came out? It was this kind of Texas Chainsaw Massacre-ish backwoods slasher torture sort of film about a group of people that went out to the city of Epicuén in Argentina, this really amazing kind of flooded out abandoned villa, to go out and film a documentary, only instead they ended up falling victim to a clan of fucked up cannibals who captured them, tortured them, and finally killed them. It was a film that had that very much kind of Rob Zombie-ish flavour to it, that sort of early 2000s gritty, grubby, nasty, hardcore sort of feel, mixed with some really amazing location shots and cinematography. The guys responsible for that film were the Onetti brothers, Luciano and Nicolas Onetti, who were mainly known before that for doing these kind of nostalgic modern giallos, stuff like Abracadabra and Francesca. Well anyway, fast forward 5 years, and now they've made a sequel to that film. Only this time, it's not the Onetti brothers, it's just Nicolas Onetti directing, whilst Luciano Onetti is once again doing the music as he did for the first one. And that sequel has been released on Blu-ray from Cleopatra Entertainment, and it is called What the Waters Left Behind Scars, which is a little bit of a mouthful, fair enough, but at the same time, it's a really cool sounding title. In fact, I think the original had a great title as well. It sort of conjured up one of those early kind of really evocative Wes Craven titles, something like The Hills Have Eyes or Last House on the Left, Nightmare on Elm Street. It's just one of those really kind of memorably poetic titles that sort of sticks with you and promises great things. But I suppose the big question is, did anyone really want a sequel to What the Waters Left Behind? I mean, if I'm being honest, it wasn't a great film by any means. I think even as far as pretty basic kind of nasty exploitation films go, it was never more than just kind of okay at best, and it did have a lot of problems with it, even down to fairly basic things like the acting was fairly rubbish, it had some kind of very irritating musical choices, and it just had this general sort of feeling of, we've seen this all done before, much better, many, many times elsewhere. I think the main attraction was just that it felt like it was a throwback to the films that were being made like 15 years ago, like your Rob Zombie stuff, Chainsaw Massacre, all those kind of backwoods, gritty, grubby sort of hardcore films. What I will say though, and I think this is sort of interesting, is that usually the way that sequels work is, you get a film that does really well, it makes a lot of money, and then somebody says let's do a sequel to it to cash in on that kind of success. And generally, the sequel comes along, it sort of rehashes some of what's gone before, adds in a couple of new things, but it never really captures how good the first film originally was. Now, strangely, I almost think it's better that in the case of What the Waters Left Behind, the first one, that it wasn't really that great in the first place, because there was just enough of a suggestion of a few kind of basic ideas, and definitely the central concept and this just amazing location that sort of makes you think that a sequel could actually take those things that sort of seemed promising and somehow manage to improve on them. It seemed like there was enough untapped potential in the first film that a sequel could succeed where the original had failed. So, the ingredients are all there, shall we say. Which is a lot of build-up when the punchline is that part 2 once again feels like it kinda misses the mark. There's certain things that I think it does better than the first one. For example, in the clan this time around, the family of cannibals, they've got a new leader who is Tadeo, played by Mario Alarcon, who I think is much more legitimately menacing straight away than the kind of slightly over-the-top campy, shrieky menace of the baddies from the first one, who I never really felt had that kind of genuine, scary quality to them, of you're stuck in the middle of nowhere with these kind of believable, hardcore psychopaths. They always just felt like bad actors with shabby clothes and dirt on their faces kind of gurning. There's also things in it that I think really missed the chance to improve on the original, like for example the two main baddies are back again, although thankfully they're not in it quite as much as they were the first time. And it's interesting that they've kept those two characters as they are, because there's one major bit of recasting which kind of makes sense on one level but is also frustrating for another. Because in the first film, the twist was, and this is a spoiler, you had this group going out to Epiquen to film this documentary, and they had along this character of Carla, who was somebody who lived there at the time of the flood, and she was being used as an eyewitness. They were going to take her back and film her there and have her reminisce. And now the twist was, to spoil part 1, that Carla was actually part of the cannibal family that lived in the ruins. And out of the original cast, I definitely think that Victoria Moretti, who played Carla, gave the best performance. And sadly, she's been recast for the second film. She's been replaced by Magui Bravi, who plays the part as much more this kind of obvious, sort of bimbo-ish type who lures in the new group of victims as this kind of seductress figure, and then kind of spends the rest of the film just sulking about without really anything much to do. Now, I can see how Victoria Moret maybe wouldn't necessarily have been right for the part in the sequel, the way that they've kind of written the Carla character this time around, but at the same time, it's a shame that we've been deprived of, I think, the best member of the original cast, when none of the others have been recast apart from her. And the main cast in this, the main sort of group of victims, if you will, are much more obviously kind of obnoxious scumbags than they were in the first film. Because originally in part 1, there was this kind of vague suggestion that in your kind of basic cannibal holocausty type way, the group going out to make this documentary about the flooding of Epiquen were paying the price for basically exploiting this terrible disaster that had happened. Now, that's a pretty basic idea, but it is a sound one. It's the foundation upon which pretty much any halfway decent backwards slasher film is built. But this time around instead, we've got this really crappy kind of rock band called the Ravens, who stumble out to Epiquen almost by accident. And there's a lot of just padded scenes to begin with of them playing a concert early on, and that's just dead screen time where nothing remotely interesting is being done. They're really just your ultimate kind of disposable victim characters who you feel nothing for, or perhaps maybe you're meant to feel that they kind of deserve what's coming to them just because they're so annoying. Regardless of their performances, their characters just don't do anything. All their plot points are just arguing and soap opera. There isn't even that kind of basic core of the original film's city folk exploiting the locals and coming unstuck. But apart from that, this film suffers from more or less, I think, the same flaws that the first film did. Now, the location, obviously, is just absolutely magical, and it's filmed in a way that makes it hard to believe that you're actually looking at a real place. It's absolutely gorgeous to look at, just from a purely visual point of view, and I think that a Nicolas Onetti has got a wonderful visual sensibility. He shoots individual images with the eye of, I think, a true artist, and he seems like a great choice for a film like this that's got that very unique setting. But the problem is that, like in part 1, the characters turn up to Epiquen, they wander around a bit, they get chased, they get captured, and then the rest of the film is just people being tortured in grubby little rooms. The location stuff is stunning, but it only represents a very small chunk of the screen time, and the location isn't even particularly used that well. It's more just a backdrop for characters going from point A to point B, rather than actually being used as a stage upon which interesting things are happening. Because at the end of the day, however you want to dress it up, this is just a people being tortured in rooms film. I'd say, if anything, we probably actually see less of Epiquen in the second film than we did in part 1, and there's still very much that feeling of let's just kind of wander around here for a while just because it looks lovely. And the action really starts when we get into the rooms, people being tied up and tortured, and those scenes are, I think, on the whole, probably staged a little bit better than they were in part 1. There isn't quite that slightly campy kind of jokey undertone to the sadism that you got in the first one. There is, however, still a slight feeling of, well, what are this family actually doing to these people? They're cannibals, right? But then they kind of molest their victims first. Then there's all this stuff with the grandfather taking a shine to one of the girls because she kind of reminds him of his dead wife. And there's just a slight feeling of, I think in films like this, the kind of grubby, nasty, intense, sort of Rob Zombie-esque, being tortured by horribly grimy maniacs in a very realistic way kind of films, that it's got to feel real and threatening. But the problem I get with this film, though, is that the threat of the family never quite feels real and immediate enough. It's not made clear enough what exactly is going to happen to the characters at any given moment, and you end up with just these scenes of people being tied up and sort of left to one side, whilst the family sort of bicker with each other. I think there's almost too many characters to contend with at times, and you almost get to see too much of the baddies so that you don't ever get a good sense of being trapped in this kind of hellish environment. And so what you get instead is you get individual set pieces. You get moments, you get sequences of unpleasant sort of rape and torture that are slotted in every now and then, but never quite feel like they're building up this kind of overall atmosphere. There is never a sense of escalation that I think you need in a film like this. There's no real pacing of events to create a satisfying story. And there's something about the set pieces themselves that do feel a little bit kind of half-arsed, if I'm being honest. Now, if you compare this release, Cleopatra, which is a much more mainstream label, with the Blu-ray for the first film, which was put out by Unearthed Films, who are known for releasing more extreme titles, I think it's possible that this might even be a somewhat cut version of the film, and I say that only because for a very basic kind of torture exploitation film, it feels like there's a definite looking away from the action at key moments that seems a little bit strange. The first film is definitely a lot tougher in terms of the nasty stuff. But I think that the bottom line is that I think Nicolas Onetti is a guy who's great at setting up images and individual shots, but who's not necessarily great at tying things together. He's a visual guy rather than somebody who's got a gift for actual storytelling, which is why I think this film feels kind of disjointed, and it's never more than just a collection of bits that are individually well shot, but which never come together. And whilst that might work fine for something like a throwback giallo or something that's less linear, like some of the Onetti brothers' other films, when it comes to a single location Chainsaw Massacre type stuck in a hellhole with a bunch of maniacs film, you really need to be able to build a sense of being trapped, of things getting progressively scarier and more intense, and of feeling like you're stuck in there with these characters, feeling what they feel. And that gets me to thinking that maybe a film like this just isn't what a Nicolas Onetti is best suited to directing. That it doesn't necessarily fit with his particular kind of visual style, and that I think instead he'd probably be better doing something that's more sort of dreamlike or ethereal, that's got a kind of looser sense of cold hard logic, where you can just sort of be carried along more by individual images and set pieces. Because Nicolas Onetti obviously has got a lot of talent. It's just that with this film, you also get to see a lot of his shortcomings, unfortunately. So what does that leave you with then? Well, what you've got is a fairly underwhelming sequel to a not particularly that great in the first place, pretty derivative torture film that had a really great title, an absolutely beautiful and wonderfully filmed location, and a fair bit of potential in that I think it's got a director who's got a very strong visual flair, who sadly just isn't too hot at stringing together a cohesive film. Although, to be fair, whilst part 1 was directed by both the Onettis, there's not much in this film that I think necessarily feels like it's being directed by just half of the talent that was responsible for the first film. You'd be hard pushed to know that they weren't just films made by the same directors. What I'd really hoped for with this was a film that had looked at part 1, that had seen all the potential that's there for making a really interesting, very visual kind of horror film, and develop that basic idea into something that felt worthy of what the first film could have been. Instead, what you end up with is a film that's better in some ways and worse in others, almost in completely equal measure. Pretty much for every improvement, like a better main baddie or a slightly more serious tone, there's something else that feels like it's a step down. Like the victims are much more annoying, they've got no real motivation or reason to be there, and that they've recast the only good actors from part 1. I think Scars is probably the more professional of the two films in that it's probably more competently directed. It doesn't necessarily have those strange moments of amateurishness that I think you got in the first one. But the real answer is that, thinking about it, there's really not that much between them. They're both kind of a level, they're a little bit below average, kind of weird mix of polished, very good looking visuals, and a really kind of ropey script, directed by somebody that seems to have trouble stringing together basic scenes of just anything actually happening. And you know, the most frustrating thing, to sum up, is that I know already that if they ever do somehow make another one of these films, I'll watch it. And I'll go into it hoping once again that it's going to deliver on that potential that I've somehow convinced myself is there somewhere in the DNA of this weird little franchise. I'd like that there's somebody out there that's still trying to do these kind of grubby exploitation films like they used to be done 20 years ago. I just kind of wish that they were done a little bit better.